a candidate told me, hey, so you guys are a compound startup. That must mean the pain compounds too. And I just felt like very, very seen and understood.
Or triggered. Like, oh my gosh.
Triggered, understood, thankful. It was the full range of emotions where I was like, wow, this person really gets it.
Cool. So I always like to have people start by just telling everybody and me a little bit about your background. So how, you can start from as early as you'd like. How did you get here?
So background-wise, grew up in South Africa. Spent the first, 2.5 decades of my life there. A little town called Stellenbosch near Cape Town. I like to explain it as like Napa and Berkeley had a baby. Napa being a wine region, Berkeley being a university town with a few interesting people in it. So spent a bunch of time there. Eventually, got a job with a company in Spain, and some more time in South Africa, and then moved to the US in 2013. Education-wise, pretty standard. Story, Dad was a civil engineer, Mom was a dentist. I became some kind of physicist, mathematician, scientist, computer scientist hybrid through all of that. I ended up studying electronic engineering as well, and then pretty standard software engineering career after that. IC into a tech lead, into a tech lead manager, into a manager, and all the way up from there. And then in the US since 2013. Proud US citizen as of about a year and a half ago. So I'm based in San Francisco. Yeah, that's me.
Cool. Great, very concise summary. We covered a lot. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got into engineering leadership, because you said, standard path, but did you intend to get into leadership, or was it more of an accidental thing?
Yeah, I think it wasn't, ever an explicit goal. Obviously, once you're some ways into it, and you wipe out your eyes, and you're like, oh wow, I'm some kind of manager now. You start figuring out how to climb that ladder. But I think early in my career, very much enjoyed writing code. Considered myself as a deeply technical, hands-on engineer. Loved building distributed systems. Looking back, I think I always gravitated towards work that made my team efficient, though. So I have memories early on from, being the person that would, suggest us having a stand-up meeting, or, fixing the test suite, or implementing some kind of new tool to make the team more efficient, or worrying about whether the builds were passing, or whether something else that the team was doing was in good shape. And this was before I was in any kind of leadership role. And so you do that for a couple of years, and then people start calling you the lead of the team, or the technical lead, or something. And so I found a lot of my early work was actually geared towards just making my teammates, the folks I was working with, more efficient, or kind of like organizing our stuff. And so I think that kind of like naturally led into some kind of management role, right? As you do that, you almost like naturally know what's going on, what everyone else is doing. And, that is almost like the first step into, running a team or managing a bigger group. So I think I almost just like naturally gravitated to that kind of work. Or maybe another way I've thought about it in the past is really just like creating the kind of environment for my team that I wish I had when I was a more junior engineer. And so this kind of like creating of a nice environment was almost like my mission from early on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and sounds like it'd be great to work on your team. So you're currently the CTO of Rippling. How would you describe your current job?
That's a good question. I think there's probably like a few pieces to it. Firstly, it's just like Rippling is a very dynamic, fast-paced, challenging environment, and so part of it is just like waking up every morning and seeing how fast you can move, seeing if you can move faster than whatever is chasing you that day, which keeps life exciting. I think there's probably like a few key elements to what I do. I think one is is like connecting the dots. Rippling is a pretty like large multi-product company, right? So we have many dozens of engineering teams. There's also a bunch of folks working on a core platform and infrastructure, and so a lot of interplay between the different products and systems. And so a big chunk of what I do is just making sure that everybody's on the same page. If engineer X in team Y is doing some work that might be relevant to someone else, making sure they talk about it. Looking for opportunities to do work together or build a common platform or system or capability. So just like connecting the dots is probably one piece. There's a decent amount of just like pattern matching against problems. So as I talk to people across the organization, just looking for recurring issues, either things I've seen, at previous companies where I might have a sense of a solution, or potentially multiple teams inside of Rippling are facing roughly the same problem, just like, identifying those issues and figuring out what we're going to do about it. There's an element of like technology strategy, whereas it's like figuring out how should we be building the products and platforms we're working on. A lot of that is not just me. It's obviously lots of other engineers solving hard design and architecture problems at the company, but making sure that that's steering in the right direction. We just finished our kind of like full year plan. So there was 2 exciting months of headcount planning and budget allocation. It's like
Fun.
staring at spreadsheets for hours on end with my finance partner Ryan. So that's been a fun part of the job recently. And then I think finally there's the processes and the tools piece, right? If you are a many 100-person team and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D in a year, there's like a 1% efficiency gain across that group is millions of dollars saved. And so I think a lot about that these days. And then finally probably like most critical of all is just like the people. And so making sure as far as possible people are happy, productive, the team is working together well. Both with regards to the existing team, making sure they're developing and growing in their careers, and we're retaining the best engineers on the team, but also finding new folks to join the cause. We've added a couple of hundred engineers since I've joined, and so finding
I feel like I've noticed a lot of new Rippling engineers when I look through LinkedIn. I feel like everywhere I turn there's another person who's joined Rippling. So congrats on all the growth. It seems really exciting.
Thank you. It's been a team effort, of course. I mean, between the engineering team and the recruiting team, we've been expanding quite a bit. Also there's a very purposeful effort to market all of that excitement on LinkedIn. So I'm glad.
Well, you guys are doing a good job. Even when it's not shown, I just go look at the profile and I'm like, this person too? You got everybody. Cool. So one thing I wanted to ask you about is I hear you're one of the best engineers out there when it comes to scaling and hardening systems. So those really technical problems. I'd love to hear more about the work you've done both as an IC and leading teams. And especially, what that transition to leading teams to do that was like, because I feel like, that's the profile of engineer that often stays IC for a very long time.
I think I'm thinking about hardening systems. I thinking back maybe all the way to Cloudflare days, back in 2013. I think there's been this recurring theme of I show up a little bit later. It's generally when the company's kind of like late Series B, maybe early Series C or something like that. It has hit some kind of inflection point in its growth, and what inevitably happens shortly afterwards is that all of the early systems, spectacularly break down, almost instantly, because there's just so much growth. They were built quickly, they were built early on, and these like version 1 systems reach the end of their design life in rather spectacular fashion. And so, thinking back to the Cloudflare days, a lot of the work I did there with a few folks on my team was rebuilding the log processing pipeline for the edge network, so a large data processing challenge, along with a bunch of other services. Very similar story at Segment. Again, when I joined there, working with Tito, who was the VP of engineering at the time, it was a very successful company. I think we're doing maybe like $20 million in ARR. Again, this like inflection point in its growth, where almost everything was doubling year over year, and data volume through the segment pipeline was probably like 5xing. And so again, early systems kind of like needing to be replaced. And I think Rippling has been more of that, but just like at even much grander scale, the stakes being even higher when you're considering critical systems like payroll and HR. And so I think that's kind of like been the recurring theme, is just like taking this system and kind of like upgrading and fixing it in place while it's already in production.
That makes sense. So one thing I always wonder is how people pick up this skill set, because it's not something you learn in school. And if you're an early engineer, it's not something you learn by doing like early engineering. So, how did you develop this skill set? How did you hone it? And also when you're thinking about, building your teams and training up developers, how do you select and train teams to be good at this kind of work?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think for me personally, back in South Africa before I moved to the US, I was lucky for a period where I worked on a team building a new 0 to 1 product. And I would say it was like a data intensive product where again we had to collect a bunch of data, store a bunch of it. There were a bunch of servers involved. It was a system that had to be highly reliable. And I almost had that opportunity, as a young engineer to build that system from first principles. Nice. And we spent a lot of time in the early days, asking questions like, how many bytes per second can we write to this hard disk, and how many bytes per second can we process through, this core of the CPU. What is the right programming language for building this kind of system, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that built, in my mind, a pretty good framework for, what is possible with a computer, what are the laws of physics constraining us here, like how fast is fast enough, or like, what's the limit. And I think that almost like first principles approach to building a system like that, or like having the opportunity to do that, what was usually helpful. I think many folks starting their career potentially join a larger company where a lot of those like early first principles things have been figured out, and like you're operating inside of a much more constrained environment doing a very specific task. I think either through studies or internships or like joining an earlier stage company, like you really want to get hands on this kind of like fundamental work to really learn how computers work. And I was able to leverage a lot of those skills, at Cloudflare and Segment to kind of like rebuild these larger systems. And so I think that was kind of like key to my success. And
that's pretty incredible to have had that opportunity early on too, because I feel like, some conventional wisdom is that if you take a young engineer, they don't have the architecture experience or, the system design experience to really thrown at some of these more data intensive problems. But I think that, your story is a testament to the fact that when done in the right conditions, it could really help with growth.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very much, I'd say my story is one of learn by doing, and I was fortunate to have a couple of amazing, senior engineers as mentors through that process. But, at the end of the day, you just have to kind of like find a way to get somebody to trust you to build one of these systems and then make a bunch of mistakes. And, that's how you learn.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're thinking about building teams for scaling and hardening systems, what kind of experience do you look for, and how much do you weight experience versus a certain skill set?
I think it's ultimately, especially for some of these more complex systems, it's really about assembling a pretty diverse team of generalists, and diverse along approximately every dimension, right? You sometimes need, engineers early in their career that will, run through walls and, question assumptions just because they haven't
go through logs for days at a time.
Exactly. Looks at the logs, looks at the metrics, they bring fresh eyes to the problem. And, you need that too, because, sometimes, one of the things that can be most dangerous is somebody that thinks they know something when it's not actually true. I think thinking about the team at Rippling, especially over the last 18 months or so, we have increased the number of like more senior engineers on the team. There is something to be said for having built something once or twice before that at least looks like or rhymes with the next challenge. And then ultimately, I think you want to combine those groups together. And so it's about a mix of experience, a mix of like having wrangled or not wrangled these kinds of systems. I think the one thing that everybody probably has in common is curiosity. Like they want to dig in, they want to understand, they want to try stuff out, and so making sure you get these folks that are very curious about making the computers do the right thing together is probably one of the most important things in building a team like this.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know some engineering leaders like to have their team mapped out from the beginning. Like, I want this many people with this kind of personality type or this kind of experience, or I like to balance junior, senior this way. Or some people have like, I like to start with 2 senior and then, everyone has their rules. Do you have your order you like to build your team, or do you like a recipe for what the final team looks like?
I think we roughly have a standard structure, whereas like there's a VP and they have maybe like 100 to 200 people under them. They have working with them a few directors and senior directors. Those folks have senior managers. Senior managers generally partner up with a staff or senior staff engineer and so on and so forth. And and then there's ultimately some kind of like core team or pod, 5 to 7 engineers, 1 or 2 folks early in their career, 1 or 2 senior engineers, 1 or 2 tech leads. So I'd say there's something like a formula to it. Ultimately, I don't think we completely force that structure. That's kind of like the guideline. When you're stepping into an environment where there's already 500 plus engineers, you kind of like slowly reshape it. And so I think that was the case when I joined Rippling as well. Maybe one of the key things back when I joined in August 2022, I think we were a little short on like more tenured folks, and so a lot of the early like recruiting efforts were actually focused at finding a few like senior staff and principal engineers to join the group. We actually had a lot of like super eager engineers slightly earlier in their career, but we actually were able to unlock a lot of productivity by just layering in some kind of like mentorship bandwidth, some folks with more experience in design and architecture, and then to some extent like having just a few of those people can suddenly unlock entire teams to produce really amazing work. And so it is also about a balance. You can over-rotate and hire too many senior people and they all sit in meetings waiting for each other to do something.
Or they all wait for somebody else to, do parts of the work. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've heard you're really good at recruiting for hard engineering jobs. And so, what is it about your approach? Is it, you've built up the network over time, or you know how to draw the right people by attracting them with a hard problem, or you ask good questions, or some combination? Like how do you get people to come work on these hard engineering problems with you?
Yeah. I think, there's maybe like a few elements. Something I did, back at Segment, and then, also after we got acquired by Twilio, and, there was a kind of like a playbook I repeated at Rippling was really to think hard about the story I'm telling about the company and where we're going. And so it is, a story about, and I ultimately build a bunch of slides in a slide deck, literally
Nice.
like a salesperson would build a sales deck, and it covers what is the product today, where are we trying to go, what are some of the hard engineering challenges. Frequently a candidate will underestimate the exciting stuff happening behind the covers. The classic case with Rippling, of course, is everyone assumes we're an HR and IT company, and they're like, yawn, HR. But then actually telling the story of the massive platform engineering happening.
Yeah. I feel like branding the engineering problems is such an important part of that.
Exactly. So telling that story, I think, is really key. helping the person understand the current structure of the teams. And then I think finally, and what's been great about Rippling is, we've had a lot of success on this front, but also sharing, how's the business doing, right?
Yeah.
People are very curious, is this a viable business? How much cash do you have in the bank? How quickly are you growing? And so helping candidates understand, how the business is doing, not just the technical problems, I think has been very key. And so I think that's one piece, is just like telling a good story that people can get excited about. And I think that then beyond that, for me, it's almost like I will just say, like, tell me about the future. What do you want to do next? And help the candidate kind of like match, their next goal or their next career aspiration to, challenges and problems we need to solve. And, it's basically just like an advisor. I don't think you can actually like trick somebody to come and work with you, or if you do, it goes very poorly. You really just want to line them up with something they were going to be excited with anyway. So it's basically this like trusted advisor role. And sometimes, there isn't a good fit, and then I'm very like happy to tell people that. And, we go on our merry way. But frequently, you find a great match, and the rest is generally history after that.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. All right, let's dig into the theme of this whole podcast, which is breaking changes. So you've been at Cloudflare, Mesosphere, Segment, and now Rippling at times of a lot of change, a lot of growth. And so I want to hear about sometimes you've had to lead your teams through changes, whether it's strategic pivots or other kinds of changes. So can you tell me about one change you introduced smoothly? And, how did you do that?
I think maybe one that came to mind, as I was thinking about this, was just shortly after I joined Rippling, we had to do a reorg of our infrastructure team. In this case, it was almost like cheating, because I'd been in the fortunate position where previously at Segment and Twilio, we had done a very successful reorg of the infrastructure group, and had found a structure, basically like 4 key teams like inside of that group, and kind of like ownership for each team that just like works really nicely, for a team building in the cloud. And so, joining Rippling, I was like, hey, this infra team seems to be organized along slightly strange dimensions, or with slightly strange ownership boundaries. Like, I know I have like high confidence that I know what is going to work here. Obviously, had to communicate about that, tell the story, convince people that it made sense. Luckily, folks were pretty receptive. We, within a couple of weeks, talked about it got everybody on board, shipped the change. 18 months later,
love it. Yeah, so fast.
Yeah. So fast, it's the beauty of having seen it work before.
And that gives you such a leg to stand on. You can just say, trust me, I've done it. I'm an expert at this change.
Yeah, you have to be careful. I mean, sometimes, coming in as a new leader, you can, follow your old playbooks to your doom as well.
Yeah.
So there was a short period of just like making sure that doing this again would make sense. But yeah, we rolled that organizational change out. The team structure is largely unchanged 18 months later, and working well for us. So I'm going to claim that as a win.
Yeah, that's incredible. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the harder and maybe more interesting question. This is also very interesting. What was one change that did not go as well?
Yeah. I think we've had a couple of, thinking about, again, like early days, a couple of changes we made in, kind of like processes and policies around basically it's like tools that engineers use to get their jobs done, when they're doing customer support tickets, or need to do some kind of debugging. We moved a little too quickly in announcing, for good reason, right? There's like security and compliance reasons to be very careful with that kind of tooling and to lock it down. Moved quite quickly in announcing some changes there. I think, we didn't do a great job of explaining the why to the team first, right? And so the reaction was like, hey, you're taking away a critical tool, you're making us less productive. Why? We don't understand the reasoning, and it's frustrating and annoying. And so I think reflecting on that change, when we retried it a couple of months later, took a lot of care in starting with the why, right? Getting everybody on board with, the fact that we have to mature these processes and tools, and then, shipping more gradually a set of changes. So I think, that kind of like rapid change without good communication, has blown up in my face.
Yeah, communication is so key in changes. I'm curious, how did that change not succeed? Did it just not take because people rejected it, or did it take but it didn't go very well?
Yeah, I think in that case, there you generally see like a lot of grumbling.
Okay, and so then you're like, okay, we have to stop.
Yeah, it's like, and I think, what inevitably happens is like, some kind of escalation, right? Where a manager is reaching out to you over Slack or whatever, being like, hey, Albert, our team is really struggling.
Stop changing.
Or just like, we have made this change and we are much slower and more inefficient as a result. That's generally a clue that like, hey, we pulled a wire here that maybe should have been pulled differently. The smoke starts coming out of the machine. It's generally a clue that you.
Okay. So it's not just communication that would have helped this change, but or it was communication maybe plus feedback that would have helped the change go more smoothly.
We ended up, in the wake of that, establishing, almost like customer advisory boards in a few key areas where engineers could give feedback to teams that generally owned tools and processes ahead of us making changes. And so, people felt more included, and, we ultimately made better changes and communicated better because, they gave us a bunch of feedback, and even gave us feedback communication about the change ahead of us, sending it out into the world.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I've been working with a people team on a change we want to roll out across a bunch of teams. And one thing we're trying out is piloting the change to get engineer feedback ahead of time. But I really like this idea of an advisory board. I feel like that's a really good alternative to piloting.
It turns out that basically everything you would do for customers of your product probably makes sense for your engineering team too. So just like run the same plays.
I am. I really like that. And I didn't think about it that way, but running a pilot is basically an analogous thing there. So, all right. So my next question is, there are some changes like reductions in force that are just never fun. People aren't going to be like, great, Albert, we love this change. Thank you. So do you have lessons from rolling out changes that are just going to be unpleasant but necessary?
Yeah. I think the one that comes to mind here is, it was mid-pandemic back at Segment, and there was a reduction in force. Fortunately at the time, it didn't really impact the engineering team, but unfortunately, a decent chunk of the rest of the company was partially impacted. And I think watching that play out, there was a very surprising end to the whole, painful experience where, many folks that were impacted ended up expressing a lot of gratitude to the company.
Oh, wow.
They were like, hey, it's really sad that, I can no longer work here, but, thank you for the time we had together. And I think this kind of like positive end to this reduction in force was, in quite some part thanks to Peter Reinhardt, our CEO at the time, who ultimately, did a good job of, again, this communication.
That's incredible.
Just like the reason for the layoff, some like, compassion, and I think ultimately also owning the decision, right? He said like, I made this decision, for the health and the survival of the business. And I think, at the end of the day, even folks that were impacted could understand the why behind it. They didn't like that they were impacted, but they could understand. And I think that kind of like transparent communication, that explaining of the why was just absolutely critical to like landing that very painful change.
Yeah, that's a really incredible story. And I think also speaks to the quality of hires that were made, that they had the maturity to say, well, I'm kind of in a terrible situation, but I still have gratitude.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that definitely lots of lessons there. All right. Well, so I guess on a more positive note, what is one thing that didn't change in one or more of the companies that that you were part of where you thought it would change? So it was a surprise that this thing stayed the same for so long.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's maybe been remarkable at Rippling generally has just been the speed of execution.
Mm,
Generally, what you see, as teams and companies get bigger, is there's some kind of, like increasing administrative overhead. Folks may become a little more careful about making decisions moving forward. I think we've been quite fortunate that there's this like very strong I think of it basically as founder DNA, and I give
mm,
Parker a
mm,
lot of credit for this, right? The tone on a couple of key things is set early on, but then also requires kind of like careful, care and feeding to keep going. I
mm,
think something
mm.
that's been remarkable, even as we've added, a few hundred engineers, is the company and the engineering team overall feels like it moves about as fast as it did, 18 months or even a few years ago. I think there's
Yeah,
even
that's
anecdotes of
incredible.
like, it's like, hey, we're even moving faster than we used to,
Mm,
thanks to
mm.
some investments in tooling, and actually, a couple of processes are making us faster, not slower. And so I think that's been great to see. Obviously something we try and keep alive.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah, I
that's
know
been
that's
very nice.
something, yeah, our CEO thinks about a lot too at Postman. And so it's always interesting for me to learn about how other companies do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
There's, I think, as Parker says, there's always, it's always easy to find an excuse to go slower.
Hmm.
It's much harder to find, reasons to go faster. But somehow we manage to keep doing it, which keeps things
Yeah, that's
exciting.
that's really great. And I do think that the investment in tooling probably has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, cool. So I would like to dig a little bit into leading teams at the growth stage because it's always a really interesting stage. Something that struck me from what you said earlier was you got into leadership because you want to create the environment that you would have liked to work in. At the same time, what people say about the growth stage is that it's not the growth stage if it doesn't hurt all the time. And so, one thing, my first question is, what kinds of things have hurt the most? And then we can talk about, how you mitigate that pain.
Yeah. Um, I actually had a very funny conversation with a candidate a little while ago. And so we were talking about this idea of a compound startup, right? And so Rippling's idea, and, I see you see this idea more and more out there right now, where, it's just like a company building, a bunch of products, quite multi-product, a single platform supporting, a large suite. And so Parker calls that a compound startup. The candidate told me, hey, so you guys are a compound startup. That must mean the pain compounds too. And I just felt like very, very seen and understood in
Or
that
triggered.
moment.
Like, oh
We're
my gosh,
triggered,
that's not
understood,
me.
thankful. The full range of emotions where I was like, wow, this person really gets it. And so, yeah, I think, the pain compounds for sure. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that, it's almost like, during this like hyper growth or like very fast growth stage, almost like every year or so, the company you joined a year ago or the company that you were very comfortable at a year ago, it is basically dead. The a
Yeah.
new company has been born. You have to fall in love with it, from scratch again. And so there's really, there's just like a lot of change. And I think, anybody that gets, too attached to, the way things are or were, a while back, it's just like, you're almost like being set up for disappointment, or, you have to kind of like embrace this like very painful change. Your role might change, who's on your team might change, what you're working on might change. Is like a lot of change. And I think that, with the right mindset, you can navigate that, but it inevitably, creates a bunch of pain. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also think
Yeah.
the other Yeah. The other key thing with growth is like everything is under stress, right? The people are
Mm.
under stress, the systems are under stress, the processes break down and need to be replaced. So, it is a stressful thing. And so, again, you have to kind of decide that you enjoy that sport, even if it hurts you from time to time.
Yeah, it makes sense. So how do you think about hiring for durability in this kind of situation? So, do you focus on hiring people that can endure, or is it, every 6 months to a year, you kind of give people the ability to leave if it's not for them, you hire new people, or, like how do you approach, evolving a team through this kind of change?
Yeah. I think, it is something that I continue to learn about. I think ultimately one of the key things you look for is just someone that either has seen this kind of growth before, right? I think, what you typically see, or, what is sometimes a challenge at, these fast growing companies is, candidates coming from larger established companies, less chaotic, much more structured. That they sometimes have a pretty rough time,
Yeah.
stepping into a hyper growth startup. What you will also find, talking to those folks or folks that have done startups before is, they sometimes crave the chaos, they crave the rapid change, and so you
Yeah.
basically want to pick out the ones that that want to run into the burning building, if you will. Maybe it's
Yeah.
not quite burning, but it's at least very warm inside.
Yeah.
But I think that's one piece. Something else we've talked a lot about, over the last year or so is the anti-sell, right? You almost want
Yeah,
to
I anti-sell
pause.
pretty hard.
Yeah, and I think the anti-sell is just key, and it can be quite intimidating initially, especially as you step into a new company. You're like, hey, I desperately need to hire people. I'm probably going to paint them a rosy picture. That always ends in tears. And then, you embrace the anti-sell, which is basically to almost like push the candidates away. And then the ones that fight to join you are actually the ones that are probably going to succeed because they really want to be there. And so
Yeah.
I love the
Yeah.
anti-sell. I'm
Yeah, me
curious to hear
too.
about your anti-selling.
Well, I learned there's a degree you can anti-sell too hard, because I feel like, at a certain point, then the person, something triggers in the person and they're just like, oh my gosh, I have to prove that I need to be there even if I don't want to. It's that like, no one has ever told me not to come somewhere this hard before. But I think I try to be pretty transparent about balancing. This is the sell, and there's going to be chaos. You're going to have to do all this stuff for yourself. You're going to have to redo this stuff every some period of time. But I
Exactly.
have
Yeah. I
I
think,
have learned the
you
too
can
hard
certainly.
anti-sell is a sell.
Yes, you can overdo it on the sell dimension and the anti-sell dimension.
Yeah.
So a good balance, as with anything.
um Yeah. So, one other related question I have for that is, how do you think about setting up people for success when they are going to need to grow to keep up with the pace of the company? So, is that a trait you hire for, or you set up the ecosystem so that they can keep succeeding?
Yeah, I think it's again a combination of both, right? We love hiring folks that are clearly high slope,
Mm-hmm.
earlier in their career, right? It's and I think many startups look out for this, right? Show me
Yeah.
the person that has gotten, from like first job to third job, got promoted 3 times in 5 years. Show me the person that was, on paper a senior engineer, but was the tech lead for a 10-person team. Show me the person that, at a small startup,
Yeah.
was working on a hugely impactful, mission critical project for the company. It's like, so number one, finding those people that are like
Yeah.
rapidly rising versus folks that have potentially hit cruising altitude and
Yeah.
value something a bit more stable. I think that's one piece. I think another one is, as far as possible, then setting those folks up with the right, mentorship, and, supporting infrastructure. Sometimes it's a very strong manager. Sometimes it's about helping them form a direct relationship to a director or a VP of engineering, to get additional mentorship. Sometimes it's just like creating a small group of their peers or slightly more senior engineers at the company, like a discussion group or a a frequent design review session or something like that. And the answer is probably like all of the above ultimately. But once you find these like high slope folks, like connecting them to as much of the supporting infrastructure as you can.
I like the intentional mentoring structure there. Cool. So we have time for the question I really wanted to get to, which is during the SVB collapse, I was really impressed with how quickly Rippling got your act together with floating payroll and all that stuff. So fun backstory. I was actually at SVB like the Thursday and the Friday of the crash. Ground floor. I was there when they handed out the flyers and they said you can't withdraw money anymore and all that. And so I was watching the story with a lot of curiosity and fear over the weekend. And so my own investors actually, they were floating payroll, and I saw how much time and work it took them to get to do that. And so I was quite amazed that Rippling turned around that Monday and said, look, no one worry about payroll. So I know you've done at least one interview about this. It must have been really non-trivial in both the logistics and operations, as well as the technical side. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think we were in the fortunate position, and we've told some of the story, but, it wasn't that we woke up on Friday and started from scratch, right? We had established.
That would have been incredible. Our investors definitely did.
So, we were in the fortunate position that we had established a commercial relationship with JP Morgan. We had been integrating our systems with theirs for a number of months, but it wasn't quite, like turnkey cut over, candidly. But, through very careful coordination, and I think, in the early hours, kind of like late Thursday into Friday, Parker played a key role here of, number one, making sure that everybody on the engineering team was aimed in the right direction. And very quickly, once we understood the situation, folks across engineering and product got organized to do our part. And what it looked like at the time was 3 stand-ups a day. A stand-up in the morning for the team in India to hand over to the team in North America. A stand-up in the middle of the day to make sure everybody in North America was unblocked. A stand-up in the evening.
That's incredible.
For North America to hand back to the team in India. So it was pretty relentless communication. And a lot of it is like keep staying organized so that we didn't lose time. I think that was one key thing. And then broadly across the business, that pattern repeated across all of the other functions.
Yeah, because I think this all turned around in 4 or 5 days?
I think we basically woke up on Friday morning. We made payments through on Thursday we were making payments through SVB. On Friday at lunchtime we were making payments through JP Morgan.
Wow.
Swapping that out in a payroll system, doing many billions of dollars a year in payroll was no mean feat. And so
that's incredible. How, what scale of engineers were involved? What number? Well, you don't have to say the exact, but I'm just curious.
It was probably all hands on deck for 50 or 60 engineers in and around the core payroll system. And there was probably easily, another group of about the same size dealing with, downstream, impacts, the risk engineering team and the team that was working on insurance and benefits, which also has a payments element. The payroll operations team that facilitates payments from Rippling to the IRS and to other tax agencies. There's a ton of people involved, and that doesn't even cover all of the customer communication that had to happen.
Yeah, that's an incredible feat of organization. I guess now that you've said that, I have one last question before our hot takes at the end, which is, we also have US and India teams, and something I think a lot about is just, what's the best way to hand off, coordinate across US and India. So I'm curious if you have lessons, advice, anything for, handing off across time zones where you do not have shared core working hours.
I think, it is ultimately, people have to compromise a little bit. something that's worked. Different folks keep different schedules. I think our team in India, a couple of days a week, tend to work a little bit later in the day to improve overlap. Something I've been doing is, Mondays and Tuesday nights, I set aside, it's kind of like do work at the office, come home, have dinner, and then have a couple of meetings in the evenings. Constrain that to a few days of the week.
If that's Monday, Wednesday for me, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you need to constrain it, otherwise, it becomes, an endless grind that tires you out. But creating that time, and then something I've done too is just like you have to get on a plane, and I'll go to Bangalore, for up to 2 weeks at a time. Did that 4 times roughly in the last year. And so just spending the time with the team there in person. There's work time, and also spending a lot of time going to dinners, doing IMAs, that kind of thing. Like it ultimately builds connections that you can rely on when you need to quickly coordinate or send a quick Slack. Right? If you invest in the connections in person, you can kind of like leverage them to move faster with less coordination.
That makes a lot of sense.
Zones.
Cool. That all makes a lot of sense. Cool. So now we're approaching our closing questions. So these are all quick takes. First one, what are the most underrated breaking changes in the industry right now?
Yeah. I think it's obviously something to do with AI. Probably, I think a lot of folks. Yeah. I think if you look at product launches right now, it feels like there's a lot of chatbots and AI summarizing text, etc. It really feels like version 0.1 of the AI revolution. My sense is somewhere at the intersection of the Apple Vision Pro and Neuralink and just generally like language-based interfaces to software, whether B2B or B2C, there's just like a massive reboot coming for like human computer interfaces. And I think it's a lot of people are kind of like looking at the Vision Pros getting returned, and they're looking at Gemini falling down and generating strange images, and kind of like laughing at that. But I think these are just like the first baby steps, and we're going to see a pretty dramatic shift here before too long. So I think it's a massive breaking change.
All right, cool. And I have to ask, what's your hot take on, AI? Maybe that's the hot take and that's the same answer.
Yeah. I'm following all of this closely. I do think it's going to take a little while to shake out. I like what Sam Altman and maybe others have said along the lines of, overestimating the impact in the short term and underestimating it in the long term. I think it's going to be massive changes, to especially the way tech work gets done, but to our society overall. I recently sat down and wrote some code, and I didn't even start with my editor. I started with ChatGPT, and it just struck me in that moment, like how much different programming is than it was even like a year ago. It is absolutely remarkable, and I think many other jobs are going to be transformed.
I feel like one of the first job interviews I ever had and failed, I was asked a bunch of like, how do you do these command line commands? And there's like, no one would ever ask you this question anymore. You could chat GPT this. Because I was like, I don't have my command book handy. Sorry. All right. What change, personal or professional, are you excited about that you're happy to share with the audience?
I think, professionally, I am really excited, maybe an obvious answer, but really excited about what we're building at Rippling right now. I think, the world sees us as a, HR, IT, and finance all in one solution, but there's actually a massive amount of engineering happening to the core platform under the covers that is going to enable a ton of new products. And so, folks are going to see that
awesome.
Arrive over the next year or two. And I'm really excited about that.
Yeah. Well, when I saw you guys pull off the SUV thing, I was like, oh my gosh, there's a lot more going on there than I thought.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so for anyone who wants to hear more from you or keep up with what you're doing, where can they find you online or find
Yeah,
your work?
I'm not the best at social media. Funnily enough, I would say I'm actually most active on LinkedIn these days. It's turned into a very fun place to hang out and see what other
Yeah, well,
folks in
I'm
the
glad you're
industry
better at
are.
LinkedIn than me because I feel like I post something on LinkedIn and I'm pretty sure people like unlink me in every time I post. So, yeah, congratulations on your LinkedIn success.
Oh, thank you. No, I think that used to be the case, but somehow it feels like actually there's better content on there these days, and you can actually learn something. So
Yeah,
I'm spending
yeah.
my time posting
Well,
over
not
there.
thanks to me, but thanks to you, I'm sure.
Or maybe thanks to the Rippling marketing and employee brand teams at least.
Yeah, definitely. It is a good brand. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on this episode. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure other people also enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gene.